Dragger, an original novel by Robert Napier, narration and images powered by AI. Chapter 8. A day or so. The same shrill horns that signaled the start of carving night sounded in the first rays of daylight. Dex startled at the piercing cry. She hadn't been sleeping, but a kind of trance had allowed her to pass the night through hunger and cold. She was stiff from sitting, but felt ashamed of her sorrows when she remembered the old skull and bones still on watch with her. She didn't stand up, though. Cautiously on hands and knees, she peered over the ledge of the perch. During the night, she had come to the bitter realization she may need to hide here again. If the carve came every year, she would have to find many places to hide. The idea of another year in Gnarlstead turned her stomach. Might as well be eternity. When she looked down, she could see the headless body still prone in the grass. Would that gentle woman rot there like the forgotten sentry? In the pit of her soul, Dex understood why someone would kill for a chance to get out of this forsaken place. She pushed the idea out of her mind. She wasn't like that. She wasn't a war ghoul. She would never hunt heads for Father's approval. But there are many places for thoughts to go besides the mind, and she could feel the icy pricks of the idea settling inside her like those arrowheads. Dex scrambled down the dark side of the tower. She sprinted the short distance to the perimeter wall and heaved herself over. She went around the outside to the moor gate. She came back over the wall and walked slowly up the throat to the courtyard, like she had been out for a casual morning stroll. Dex tried to be cautious. She really did, but she was so tired and scared, she couldn't help but hurry a little. She was extra careful as she passed the manor, and had made it inside the gore sty when Vago called out to her from behind. Dex shrank in her clothes, her hair tumbling over her face. By the sound of his voice, he was several yards away. She considered ignoring him or running from him, but neither had ever worked in the past, and she knew they wouldn't work now. It was still dark in the sty, and she doubted he could see her. He must have been following her or waiting for her. She didn't turn around. "I knew you'd come crawling back to your sty sooner or later. I didn't think you had the nerve to stay out all night. That was my mistake." "Carving night is over," shouted Dex, still not turning. "It's still night in there." Dex growled with frustration. Why couldn't he just leave her alone? She faced him. He stood square in the entrance, trying to fill the space. He had a ridiculously small knife in his hand. Dex doubted he could cut anyone's head off with it. But however small, it was well sharpened and glinting in the morning light. "You're not going to make me chase you, are you?" He glanced over at the bundle of javelins he had resting against the wall. Dex walked towards him. "You don't have to do this. None of us do." "You're right, I don't have to." Dex had a small sack knotted over her shoulder. Vago had not noticed it until now. She untied the bundle and offered it to him with both hands. "Here, I brought you a head. Take it." Vago eyed the sack suspiciously. He carefully tucked the knife into his belt, then took the bundle. As it transferred hands, the tattered cloth fell away, revealing a human skull. Vago shook with surprise, but stood fast. "What is this? Where did you get this? What do you care? You've got your head. Just leave me alone." Dex boldly stepped past him into the yard. She didn't run or dodge, just stepped. Now she was in the sunlight by the mended fence. Even as he stared at the weathered skull in his hands, Vago's body moved mechanically to follow her. "Is this a joke? Father doesn't want some relic. He wants a head." A head! Vago pivoted and slung the skull as hard as he could. It was an impressive toss, causing the skull to strike the foundation of Gnarlstead Manor and shatter into uncountable pieces. While he was distracted and admiring his own handiwork, Dex stooped down and grabbed the carpenter's hammer that had been left on the ground all night. When Vago turned around, he saw her ready to pounce on him. She didn't, though. She had hesitated. She might have struck at him a moment sooner and taken him by surprise. But Dex wasn't like that. That was why she was weak. That's why Vago always won. Come on, gremlin. What are you going to do with that? Break your fucking jaw. Vago laughed, but it wasn't a confident laugh. He rested his hand on his knife. It did seem rather small now. He backed away. All right. I was just kidding anyway. You're so stupid. He yawned. It's morning already. Father will be here soon. I got better things to do. Once he had backed out of her range, he turned and walked off. When Dex was sure he was gone, she darted into the sty and ran for the hole in the wall. She sat in that dark space for a long time. She didn't feel like talking to Trek. She was mad at him. After all those history lessons, he never once mentioned carving night or the carve, or ship captains even. She didn't realize she was gripping the hammer in her hand so tight her knuckles were pure white, and the handle creaked. She dropped it, and it clanged on the stones beneath her, creating flakes and sparks, only visible in that dark place. The ring of the hammer was the sound of clarity in her mind. She would break through the stone wall, pull Trek out, and they could escape together back to his family. Surely he could help her escape. He knew all about battles and roads and villages. He was a Vinian knight. Just as she sat up to go tell him the good news, she heard the horn of Dragger braying in the distance. The doleful wail resonated across the moors, and the very stonework of Gnarlstead vibrated to his call. He was close. She mustn't be late for his arrival. The escape would have to wait a day or so. She could put up with anything for a day or so. Ruby and Vago were waiting for her. When Dex came out of the sty, she saw them standing arms akimbo. Her heart and head sank like boots in the mud. Ruby's gore whip swayed in her hand. Vago stood just behind her. She stole a hammer and tried to kill me with it, whined Vago. Carving night is over, you cheater. Ruby showed no sign of caring what he said. She was bored and tired and looked eagerly towards Dragger's arrival. Where's the hammer? Asked Ruby, surveying the other tools still nearby. I don't know, answered Dex, frozen in place. You've been accused. I really don't care if you cheated or not, but we can't have tools or weapons go missing, can we? How will we keep our home safe and in good condition? What is your justification? I don't know, repeated Dex. She doesn't know anything, scoffed Vago. Where is the hammer? Repeated Ruby. Dex gritted her teeth. She couldn't give up the hammer. If she told Ruby, then she would know about the hole in the wall and about Trek, and then they could never escape, and Trek would miss his family, and she would never have any friends. She couldn't let that happen. I don't have it, she said through her teeth. That was true enough. More true than Ruby was concerned about anyway. I lost it. Ruby sighed heavily. Such carelessness. You have to learn to be more careful. Dex and Ruby stared at each other for a moment. Ruby snapped her fingers and pointed. Dex understood what that meant. She shuffled forward, turned her back to Ruby, and knelt on the ground. Ruby laboriously unwound her whip, as if it were an endless chore she did on Dex's behalf. She stepped back a few paces, pushing Vago aside. With a swift, hideous crack, she lashed Dex's back. Dex screamed and fell over, crying. Get up, demanded Ruby. Get up. Dex, trembling, already feverish from the stroke, pushed herself onto her knees. Before she had stabilized herself, a second strike split the shirt off her back, leaving a bright red X between her shoulders. Dex didn't scream this time, but bit down on her hands. Ruby raised her whip for another round, but a growing commotion broke over them. Ruby stepped back to look out over the walls. The plaza gate was opening. Father had returned. Ruby and Vago dashed away, as if Dex had ceased to exist. She cried quietly on the ground until her legs stopped wobbling. She held her shirt closed and headed across the compound to the heap. She couldn't let Father see her like this. No one paid any attention to her. Even the slaves were thrilled for Father's return. He brought food and treats, clothing, blankets, cookware, firewood, shoes, games, and most importantly, news of the outside world. Dragger was accompanied by dozens of followers, mostly fighters, war ghouls disguised in white armor, but also fresh slaves, and sometimes orphans. There were no new callows this time, though. He brought several pack animals, including gores he had trained to carry burdens far too heavy for horses. There was no fanfare, save the solitary horn from earlier. Gnarlstead was a secret, and Dragger traveled far and wide out of his way to hide his true path. Dex watched their arrival from the heap. The blockhouse was taller than the old watchtower, thanks to the artificial hill it sat on. It was strange to see Father's arrival from this perspective. The first time she had been buried in his fur cloak. So much had happened since then. Now she shuddered at the thought of approaching him, let alone getting close enough to share his warmth. He was an intimidating figure, immediately recognizable. Not only did he ride at the front, but he was at least a head taller than anyone else, and he seemed wider than two men shoulder to shoulder. Dex was at great pains to change her shirt. She couldn't stop the bleeding because she couldn't reach the cuts. She was alone in the heap as the other callows had dutifully lined up to welcome their father. She knew that the good slave woman would have helped her if only she were alive instead of lying headless in the weeds. Dex wondered who would be promoted, who would be the lucky one, or were there other headless bodies out there she didn't know about? She imagined Vago hacking away at her with his knife. Why did he hate her so much? Still shaking from the pain, Dex came down from the heap and headed for the plaza. The tail end of the parade lingered there. Food and drink had been brought out by the slaves, and the war ghouls in white were ritualistically changing their armor by the barracks. Dex stared at their scarred bodies. She even noticed the X mark of Ruby on some of their backs. Like it or not, she was becoming one of them, a little of her flesh at a time. As Dex hobbled across the plaza, the rest of Gnarlstead was gathered in the courtyard. Dragger, Ruby, and the war ghouls were standing together under the pergola. Down in the courtyard, other war ghouls filled the first row, then the mercenaries, then the callows, then the slaves. Dex pushed her way to the back of the callows, technically the front of the slaves. Fortunately, Gretch stood between her and Vago. Otherwise, Dex wasn't sure what might have happened. She was in too much pain to hear what Father said. She had to stand there bleeding for what seemed like an eternity. Father's voice faded in and out of her awareness. The Crush and Joe Zen squabble back and forth while we suffer and die for their empty empires and hollow ambitions, and so on. Our true justice, long ignored and abused, will rise up to wash away the old orders. On and on. When I was a small boy, I saw men and women like you stripped and murdered. I hated the Crush then, but I learned that if people don't stand up for themselves, then they deserve to be slaughtered. Father's voice seemed to surround her as her vision blurred. My children, what we build here today will usher in a new future. Very soon, we will. Dex didn't get to hear the rest of the speech. She fainted. No one caught her. When she woke, the crowd had gone. Father Dragger was standing over her. His huge form blacked out the sun. I must have bored you, Piglet, said Dragger in a smooth, calming voice. Dex shook her head, half covering herself from a blow, half reaching for help. She couldn't remember how she got here. You missed the promotion. Dex was disoriented and stiff. When she saw Ruby and Vago, she skittered backwards on her butt. I'm sorry, Father. I don't know what's wrong with me. I didn't mean to. Dragger stared down at her. Tell me you love me, and all is forgiven. Dex knew the formula and didn't even have to think about it anymore. The words beaded on her lips like blood from a cut. I love you, Father. Now I hear we had some excitement during carving night. No, Father, no excitement, mumbled Dex, not sure how much trouble she was in. Vago stepped forward. He'd already tried to tell Ruby that Dex had attacked him with a hammer, and she hadn't seemed to care, so he used another angle. She tried to trick me, Father. She tried to give me an old skull for carving night. Why would she do that? Vago had to think about his answer very carefully. Because she knows I would cut her head off, Father. Easily, I would have. For you, Father. Where's the skull now? I smashed it. I smashed it into dust, said Vago proudly. That's too bad. Vago's breath caught in his throat. It's true. I can show you. It's too bad you smashed it. It was a skull, Father. A dirty, old skull, not a head. And what is a head made of? Vago turned ghostly pale. He looked at Dex, then Ruby, then down at the ground. He was sure this was a trick question. He just needed time to think. A head has hair. Suppose I shave your hair, my son. He ran his fingers over Vago's scalp. Does that mean you don't have a head? Yes, Father. And no, Father, stammered Vago. Just as you say. Drager laughed deep and cool. A warrior must be creative and resourceful. It's too bad you smashed it. You might have been the youngest war ghoul in history. Drager laughed and pushed Vago down. Vago didn't even react. He just stared coldly at Dex, as if his eyes could sever her head. Drager wrapped his huge arms around Ruby and walked off with her, as if she were a cool mug of beer. Mishku, he said in a soft growl. They left Vago and Dex on the ground, ready to kill each other. Vago found his feet first. He stood over Dex, wanting so badly to pound his fists on her stupid face, but Rux was standing on the other side of the courtyard, watching, with his hafted weight on his shoulder, looking very much like Drager's hammer. He shook his head slowly at Vago. He won't always be around to save you, he whispered, before sulking off. Dex slowly got up and dusted herself off. She felt like crying, like throwing up. She wanted to run away and hide. She wanted to scream at everyone for being crazy and mean, but she knew it was useless. She knew they'd never stop hating her. Rux came over to her to see that Vago was safely gone. He steadied her as she wobbled from a fever. Come on, he said. I'll take you to your bunk. I'm fine, rasped Dex, barely audible through her hair. You're just a kid, insisted Rux. So are you. So's everybody. She pulled her arm away and stumbled off towards the gore sty. Dex was determined to free Trek, not for his sake, but for hers. He was the only one who could help her. She was less cautious than usual as she made her way down into the shotery. She went to the far wall and painfully climbed down. She found the hammer waiting in the dark. Her left arm was numb, or maybe she imagined it. Either way, she held it close against her body while she began to bang away at the masonry around the hole. Her strikes were feeble, but in that quiet, hollow place, the noise rang out like temple bells. Trek appeared at once, looking in on her. She ignored him and struck again. He nearly panicked at the sound, so that he thrust his arm through to prevent another blow. What are you doing? He demanded, pulling the hammer from her trembling grip. The whole place can hear you. I don't care, she screamed back at him. I want to go home. She didn't even know the meaning of the word, and she started to cry again. She hated her tears, because they always betrayed her, made her look stupid and weak. Trek, with some difficulty, reached both arms through the wall and pulled Dex into his cell. She was limp in his arms. He felt the blood on her back. Kahijo, what have they done to you? Dex didn't know what Kahijo meant, but she felt it must be a tender name for her. She could imagine him calling his own children that, as he cradled them to sleep. I stole the hammer, she said weakly, so we could escape and go home and see your wife and sons and Nethertine and Mama. Trek laughed abruptly. It was an absurd notion that, what, we would break down the wall with a hammer and fight our way through dozens of assassins and mercenaries into the barren lands of the enemy. But Dex's face was pale and serious. He regretted that laugh and pushed the hair out of her face. It was a good plan, but you can't risk yourself like that. These people are dangerous, fanatical. You must never risk yourself like that. You're too important. I am? You're Dex. So what? Have you seen any more lying around? Dex thought about it. At least she tried to think about it. But the room was spinning. When Dex woke up, she was by the fire. She found if she didn't move, the pain was less terrible. Trek was holding a small square object that folded in the middle. What's that? She asked. He was surprised to see her awake. He didn't know what she meant at first, but followed her gaze to the object in his hand. This? It's a book. He held it out to her, so she could see it more clearly, but she could see it well enough without reaching for it. It's a book. You read it. Dex shook her head. Little Morik loved to read. Reading? You never? Trek felt ashamed. He had been given so many books to read as a child, and given so many to his children, more than he or they could ever finish, and she had never seen even one. He set the book aside. Drager had it brought to me. No doubt, his minions burned a whole library, and this is the one that got away. He's mocking me. Trek lifted her body. God, she was so light. It horrified him to feel her ribs and arm bones, and drying blood on her back. He laid her on his bed and pulled blankets over her, never minding how bloody and filthy she was. He had no medical supplies, but sought around the room for cloth he could shred by hand to make bandages. He quickly abandoned this, though, as the heavy doors creaked open. For a moment, he panicked. Ruby was back to torture, or mock him, and they'd discovered Dex sleeping here and take her away, and who can say what would happen to them both. But the panic passed. There was nothing he could do, so he faced the penalty head on. The light from the hall was bright compared to the dungeon, and it sharply silhouetted the unmistakable figure. Dark and looming Drager blocked all the light as he entered. Trek busied himself with some dishes on the table, as if cleaning up after a delightful afternoon meal. Back so soon? Come to hide from the consequences of your misdeeds? You can have my place. I should think you would welcome my hospitality. Better respite than you could hope for from your other victims. Drager banged his helmet onto the table, upsetting the glassware, sending one goblet over the edge. But then, you always were more shameless than me. A benefit of your noble upbringing, I suppose. Just kill me then. If you're so righteous, if you're so angry, just get it over with. Death is meaningless for men like us. To live is the true horror. But if it's any consolation, the rest of the world already thinks you're dead. In fact, they've forgotten you already. The other day, I spoke of you to one of the officers, a younger man who had never heard of Commander Dweller or his Deltaic Legion. To think how little we impress upon our replacements. You're lying. It's only a matter of time before the Knights of Vin and all the wrath of the Emperor appear at your walls. You've been deceived, old friend, but not by me. As far as anyone beyond my walls is concerned, you're dead, killed by your own vainglory in a failed raid of a forgotten village. Tyrek joined him at the table, as when they played strategy games at the academy. You don't know anything beyond your own twisted head. Sooner or later, you see those soldiers there? Drager pointed at the Crussians guarding the door. Presumably, they were war ghouls in disguise. You think they only come in white? No, they wear orange and green, and silver and gold. My children are everywhere. It was one of my children who comforted your wife when she learned of your demise. My children tutor yours in riding and Plethinian, and watch over them as they sleep. I could bring them here with a word, if it served any purpose. You overplayed your hand, Drager. Now I know you're lying. We don't have to be enemies. I admire you, you know that? The way you protect your delusions so doggedly. I wish I could inspire that blind loyalty in all my own children, and that's what I've come to talk to you about. Tyrek rose from the table. I don't have anything more to say to you. Just listen then. I have made great strides in the education of these boys and girls, these orphans that you created by sacking and pillaging across the valley all those years. But my aspirations have evolved. I want to start from scratch, and I want you to help me. Get out, barked Tyrek, smashing his fists on the table, rattling the dishes. Just imagine your children and mine, Grok and Zen united. Your noblest of bloodline combined with my purest of teachings. This whole sacred valley can be born again. If ever we were friends, then heed me now. Tyrek stood mere inches from his rival, and neither feared the other. Your illness worsens by the hour. If my old friend is still in that costume somewhere, I pity him. Drager nodded patiently. He excused himself from the table and replaced the helmet over his face. I hope you'll reconsider Ruby's offer. Or perhaps Next time, you'd prefer your gore girl. She'd do anything for you. Tyrek snarled, and his fists rose. Haven't you done enough? He swung at the mask, but Draggr easily caught his strike. Tyrek was no match unarmed for the hulking warlord, and never had been. Draggr brushed him aside, and his black cloak swirled in the doorway. We've only begun. When Dex awoke the second time she was lying in bed, the fire was much lower now. Trek was brooding by the dying flames. Dex dared to stretch a little, wincing with pain. The skin across her back was tight and angry. You can't stay here, Trek said. They'll take you eventually. They'll take you away, like they've taken everything else from me. Dex sat up cautiously. You can't, he barked at her. You need to get fresh bandages, or you'll die. I've seen it before, many times. I'll be fine. No, you won't. You're not listening to me. You can't do stupid things like that. You'll get yourself killed. Is that what you want? Dex drew back, afraid. You can't save me. I can't help you. Promise me you won't come back here. Ever. Dex shook her head. This couldn't be right. Trek would never say that. Just get out of here now. Dex shook her head again. Something was wrong. She did something wrong. I'm sorry, Dex, you have to stay away from me. Go. Despite the pain slicing down her back, she jumped up and ran to the wall. Without looking back, she crawled up into the shotery and ran. She didn't care if anyone saw her. She didn't care what anyone thought. She would show them no fear. She would show them no weakness. She would survive. And one day, alone if she had to, she would get the fuck out of Gnarlstead.
Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe.